Okay, hi everybody. My name's Keenan. I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I think about the temperature of forest canopies. Specifically, how does the structure of a forest impact the temperature of its leaves? Now, before we get into that, I first want to answer the question, why temperature? Why do we care about this parameter? Well, temperature is the ultimate biophysical parameter. This is a property that controls how plants function at multiple scales. And this graphic on the bottom here, think of that like a scale. And for a particular plant, certain factors warm the plants and they cool the plant. And we can think of this on many dimensions in terms of the microclimate, how much light is hitting a leaf, the leaf shape and other intrinsic qualities of the plant, as well as what that plant is doing. If a plant is consuming water, it can evaporate that water to cool itself off. We call that transpiration. And so there are many factors at an individual leaf level that drive the temperature of a leaf. So if you know temperature, you can estimate how these drivers are affecting a particular ecosystem. So that's the small scale. But we can also think about a larger scale, where pick any combination of factors that describe your particular ecosystem, and we can then project how does that influence the movement of water and carbon at a canopy scale and at an ecosystem scale. This is useful for thinking about how climate change is going to affect forest ecosystems, and it helps us project things like drought stress and movement of carbon. So in general, the temperature of leaves is very closely coupled with air. It's very close to air temperature. And there are two main sources of heating and cooling that we think about. The first is net radiation, which I'm calling R sub n. That's the amount of heat that gets added from incoming light from the sun and the surroundings. And then this lambda E, that stands for latent heat flux. That's all that heat that is lost by evaporating water. If you've ever gone swimming and when you come out of the pool and your skin feels very cold, that's the exact same process that leaves do. And that tells us something about what the plant is doing without having to even touch it. But the problem is that if you want to use any kind of remote sensing thermal data source to think about plants, they're really resolution limited. This is just kind of a smattering of what's available right now. And you can either have strong temporal resolution, best we can get is about daily, or you can have strong spatial resolution from NEON's AOP or NASA's G-LIGHT program, but you can't have both. So what I want to do is combine two data sets that individually excel on these resolution axes and combine them to think about how temperature changes at different vertical positions in a forest canopy. And we did that by combining micrometeorological data from eddy covariance flux towers. That gives us our strong temporal component. And then we combined that with a radiation submodel derived from LiDAR data, and that gives us our strong spatial component. So you put those together, and then that disappeared for some reason. And then we combine those two together, and we are left with very high resolution leaf temperatures. I'm stuck here. What's going on? There we go. So this is kind of a restatement of what I just said, a little bit more of the model flow. So we start with a LiDAR point cloud. This is something that's collected from a laser scanner mounted on a plane. And then you can estimate in that cloud how much light is available to a particular plant. Light here is kind of equivalent with like heating almost. And then we have an eddy covariance flux tower in the woods, essentially that is measuring things like wind speed, relative humidity on a vertical profile. And this lets us, we combine those two things into an energy balance model. We solve that to give ourselves a leaf temperature, and now we can map leaf temperature at very high resolution throughout a forest. So that's the gist of it. Now let's look at some data. LiDAR isn't really a data set that a ton of people get to work with, and it's really fun to look at, so I just want to show you some of that first. This is what a cloud looks like. It's all very dark right now. I'm coloring all the points by how much light is available. Naturally, it is before sunrise, so the canopy is quite dark. Just to orient you, that yellow vector up at the top, that is describing the direction of incoming sunlight. And so if we run this animation for about a day, you can see that as the sun comes up, more light hits the canopy, but most of that radiation is concentrated in the top of the canopy. It's very shady at the bottom. Again, this is very groundbreaking work. If you go below a canopy, it's shady. Who would have thought, right? But we can represent this on a computer, and we can do this quantitatively. That's the real value add of this particular component. But we can also think about simulated forest scenes. So this is a forest that I essentially made up on my computer, and I was interested in how the spacing of trees, so the horizontal structure of a forest, influences the light environment. The scatter plot on the left here is showing you the relative amount of radiation that is available at different vertical positions. And now if I start pulling these trees apart, I start spacing them out more and more, we start with a really strong vertical gradient in radiation. But as those trees come apart, there's less shading between one tree to another. So we end up losing that gradient, or at least a lot of it. And for very sparse forests, this is what you might see in like a very dry place like Colorado or just the American Southwest in general, there really isn't much of a vertical gradient. So this tells us then that perhaps vertical gradients in temperature that we see in very dense forests, like where I'm from in Seattle, these may not be replicated in more sparse forests. So that's one way to use LiDAR. Another way of using LiDAR is to inform model validation. So one of the really useful instruments on these eddy covariance towers I'm working with are called radiometers. They're essentially a thermometer that reaches out into, you can think of it kind of like a camera, but instead of looking at light, it looks at heat, and it estimates how hot things are in front of it. This is an example of one of those towers. This is at Wind River Experimental Forest in southwestern Washington State. And if I run my model on different vertical positions, you can see on the left-hand column, this is Lower Tea Kettle in California. Just, another example. And what I want to draw your attention to is that the bias of the model starts hot up in the canopy. So we're missing hot in the upper canopy and then missing cold in the lower canopy. And I was trying to rack my brain for a while of like, why is this happening? Why is this model biased in such a consistent way? But it turns out that all those radiometers, this data was provided by the National Ecological Observatory Network, or NEON. It turns out they record the exact vertical, horizontal position of those radiometers and their orientation. So we know exactly where they are looking, and we know their FOV. So we can use a LiDAR point cloud to represent what the radiometer sees. And if you do that, you get a view that looks like this. And so what does this mean? I'm showing you a whole bunch of green dots. What this means is that in the upper canopy for both Tea Kettle and Wind River, there's lots of foliage. There's lots and lots of green points. That means that the radiometer signal that comes from the tower, that temperature, is probably representative of leaves. But as you move lower in the canopy, there's fewer and fewer of those green cubes. There's less foliage. So the radiometer signal there may not be representing leaf temperature. It may be representing other things like bark, stems, branches, tower infrastructure, or the ground that has a fundamentally different thermal regime than the foliage that we are interested in. That's not the entire story, and I'm not trying to just explain away some errors in the model just by showing you this. But this is one way that we can help ourselves inform where our model is performing well. So now let's go back to the original question. What factors are driving the temperature of leaves? Now the first thing I want to do is just do a very basic attribution of the variance in leaf temperature to different driving variables. If we start with just the raw leaf temperature signal, that is almost completely explained by air temperature throughout a variety of sites around the country. And again, this goes back to our initial observation. Leaf temperature is very closely coupled with air temperature, so it makes sense that in that leaf temperature signal, it is largely explained by air. This also tells us, there's no really blue up here either. So that latent heat flux component, which is related to the plant function, that's not explaining much variation in leaf temperature. So that may tell us actually that raw leaf temperature does not tell us anything about whether a plant is using water, whether it is drought stressed. But if we subtract out that T air signal, we instead find that the leaf air temperature difference is driven by leaf stomata. And that is an indicator of drought stress. So this tells us something about what thermal regimes mean in forests around the United States. leaf temperature, absolute leaf temperature, is not really necessarily driven by plant function, but the difference between leaf and air temperature is. So if you want to use any kind of thermal remote sensing to project drought stress or think about ecosystem responses to other environmental stressors, you can't just have the land surface temperature or the leaf temperature. You have to also compare that with air. Now I'll finish by just asking, how does tea leaf change through a canopy? That was really the motivating question for this entire project. Now I'm going to show you a whole bunch of bar charts here, and before I overwhelm you with a bunch of data, I want to explain that just a little bit. So remember we said that leaf temperature is generally very close to air temperature. Well, we can decompose the leaf temperature into two of those forcings I mentioned earlier, net radiation and latent heat. We can use this by putting two bars essentially next to each other horizontally. That red bar is heating and sometimes cooling due to net radiation, and the blue bar is cooling due to that transpiration latent heat flux. Take those two bars, add them together, that white dot is the net tea leaf, tea air difference. So I repeated this over the 9 study sites I showed you earlier and at 3 different canopy positions, and we get something like this. There's a lot going on here, and some of those are missing that middle section just because the forests are not really tall enough to have a meaningful middle. But what's remarkably consistent is that across many of these forest sites, upper canopy is warmer than air, lower canopy is cooler than air. And that, in general, is being driven by the amount of radiation available and not the transpiration component. There's some additional detail to go through this story, but I don't really have a whole lot of time up here to get into those details, and quite honestly, most of you probably don't want to hear them, so we'll just skip over that. But thank you. I appreciate all of your attention. If you're interested in learning more about this project, I'm presenting an e-lightning talk tomorrow morning. And then some others in my lab are also presenting on things like wetland carbon and tropical forest change using similar things as what I talk about here. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.